I've been trying to come up with a program for our Rotary Club today for a couple months now, and I've just struck out. However, I got to thinking about it, and I said, well, you could talk about your journey to China, or you could talk about your African safari. But I've not done either one of those things, so I can't talk about that. But I did take a journey that lasted 49 years, and that is the banking industry. I'm not going to talk about banking today. However, as a result, have a seat there, Doc. As a result of being in the banking business for 49 years, I have experienced a lot of interesting things that I think are interesting, and I thought maybe you might too. So I thought I'd just share a few with you today. Again, this is not about banking. It's things that occurred as a result of me being in banking. So I'll just start. Some of them are scary, some are funny, some are sad, and some are thrilling. And I've just had a lot of neat experiences. And I guess I'll start at the beginning in 1969 when I started in business. Back in those days, unlike today, when you go into the banking business back then, they expected you to learn everything starting with a teller position all the way through. So I started as a teller. Shortly after a few months, 6, 7 months of doing that, I was assigned to the loan department. And the first thing I had to do was do collection work. And this is the scary story. There was a gentleman that was a few years older than me in the bank that said, come on, get in the car. We got my little Volkswagen Bug. We're going to go out and repossess a car. So we headed for the country, and we came to this dirt road, tree-lined dirt road. You couldn't even see the house from the road when you started backing. And we got within probably 100 yards of the house. And here standing outside was this lady and 5 little kids with her hand up like this. So we stopped about 100 yards short. And I got out of the car, and the other gentleman said, we're here to pick up your car. You've missed 3 payments, and we're coming to get your car. She turned around, and she stepped inside the house, and she came back out with a .22 rifle. And she said, like, you know what, you were going to take my car. She said, my husband left me to get yesterday with 5 little kids. And the guy continued to talk a little bit, and I said, we better leave. This doesn't look good. And he kept talking, and about that time I heard a ping. She fired a shot, hit my Volkswagen Bug bumper, and bounced off. And I did not realize how fast a Volkswagen Bug would go in reverse. Because I set a land speed record in that thing. I jumped in that thing, and he was hanging on the side, and we tore out of there. That's my scary story. That's the only scary story I got. About a year or 2 later, this would have been in the early 70s. How many are baseball fans? You remember the Big Red Machine? Okay. I lived in a little town that was about 35 miles out of Cincinnati, east of Cincinnati, along the Ohio River. And there was a local realtor in town who was also the bullpen catcher for the Cincinnati Reds. His name was Gary Waits. I became quite familiar with him. We became pretty good friends. And he took the bullpen catcher's job primarily so that he could cultivate business, you know. And keep in mind, back in those days, ball players, even the big names, were only making $200,000 or $300,000 a year, which seems big, but back compared to today, it's nothing. Anyway, he came to my office one day and he said, I got a couple of ball players who want to buy a farm out here. They want to invest in a farm. Would you be interested in financing it for them? I said, sure. So he said, I'm going to bring him out to look at the farm in a couple of days, and I'll bring him by the office and introduce you. And I'm sitting in my little cubicle office, which, by the way, the ladies' restroom was off the back of it, so people went through my office to get the ladies' bathroom. In walked Johnny Bench and Pete Rose into my office. And of course, I'm a 24-year-old kid, and I'm just mesmerized by this. Here they walked in. Johnny Bench has on a baby blue leisure suit, and Pete Rose has on a cream-colored one. I'll never forget that day. And I'm just mesmerized by this, even though they're my age. These were the biggest names in baseball. Talked to him for a few minutes the best I could. I stammered a lot, I'm sure. But anyway, got along great with him, had a great conversation. And Gary waits at the end of the talk and got the basic information from him about the price of the farm and how much money they wanted to put down. So Gary said, you want to ride out to the farm with us? And we're going to go take a look at the farm. So sure, I'd love to do that. So go outside. They parked out back so no one would see them. And here sits Pete Rose's canary yellow 72 model Eldorado with a burgundy vinyl top, with a burgundy interior. So long story short is, got in the car with him, spent the afternoon with him looking at the farm, and became somewhat acquainted with him to the point that I got in the clubhouse a few times after that. The guy that owned the bank had 4-box seats right behind the dugout, so I went to a lot of games anyway. Anyway, that was my youthful, exciting story about meeting somebody famous. It was really a cool thing to happen. They came back a few weeks later, we closed the deal. Never saw them personally again, but got to know them for a short period of time. Okay, after that position, I went to West Virginia. Nothing really eventful there except one event I'll mention, and that was this modern day Bonnie and Clyde came in the front doors of the bank to rob it. He had a 3-piece suit on, tie, no mask, no nothing, with a woman with him dressed to the hilt. At this point, I was the senior vice president of the bank. And in the vault, we had a separate little deposit box size, oversized deposit box that kept excess cash in. And the rule was you always keep that locked at all times until you need to get money out of it. The guy comes in and he points the gun at our head teller and says, take me to the vault, give me all your money. And he points to the back, he said, I want the money in that too, and he points to this. Well, unbeknownst to me, he did not lock it that day, he left it unlocked. And he pointed the gun and he said, if you don't open that, I'm going to kill you. He walked over and it opened and my mouth fell open. It probably saved some lives that day because he disobeyed the rules. So that was the only event I have to mention about the West Virginia period of time. After being in West Virginia about 10 years, I had made some friends through banking out in the Midwest and Kansas, Nebraska area. Got a call from a friend one day and he said, at this point I had never been a CEO of a bank. He said, no group of people are looking for a CEO in a small town out in Kansas. Would you be interested? And I don't want to go to Kansas. But anyway, long story short is they invited me out for a visit. I decided to do it. Well, the interesting thing about the 10 years out there was it probably was one of the most intriguing 10 years of my life. The reason being, if any of you have ever driven west on Route 70, you've gone by a town called Junction City, Kansas. It's right on the interstate, an hour west of Topeka. It's a community of 25,000 people. However, that's not the noteworthy thing. The noteworthy thing is that it sits right next to an extremely large military installation called Fort Riley, which is the home of the most famous of all, the Big Red One, Infantry Division. There were 45,000 soldiers and spouses and kids on Fort Riley. combining with the 25,000 in the community. Fort Riley was an extremely important part of the economy of Junction City, as you can imagine, because they rented housing, they bought food. We probably had 5 or 6 supermarkets simply because of Fort Riley. At any rate, I knew nothing about the military when I went out there, but I quickly learned I better find out because this was expected of me. It was expected of community leaders to be involved in the military. Now, this was right around the time when they were almost into the Desert Storm era, back in the early to late 80s. After making some connections within the military community, I was placed on what was called the protocol list, which meant that if you were on this list of about 20 people in the community, you were invited to everything. And the military is extremely big on pomp and circumstance. A lot of formal affairs and things like this. I got acquainted with every commanding general that served out there, starting with a man by the name of Gordon Sullivan, who means nothing to you probably, but Gordon Sullivan was the commander on Fort Riley when I went to town. And played golf with him, got involved, and became very, very good friends with Gordon Sullivan. I had privileges to play golf on the post golf course. I could come and go as I pleased on the post because it was a big deal. Fort Riley was where General George Custer was stationed when he went to Little Bighorn. That's how famous it is. It's a very old fort that has a lot of sandstone buildings on it. It's just a beautiful facility covering 90,000 acres. While I was the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, the military announced that they thought they needed to acquire an additional 30,000 acres surrounding Fort Riley, which threw the farmers in an uproar. You know, we're not giving up our land. It became a very heated topic. You all heard of Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense during this period of time. Dick Cheney decided to come to Fort Riley and hear the stories of the farmers and give the community an opportunity to also voice their concerns if they did not get the land, because if we lost the 1st Infantry Division, it would have destroyed that community. A couple of the community leaders said, we want you to give the speech to Dick Cheney on behalf of the community. I said, guys, I've got a lot of good farm customers. I cannot stand up there and do this and alienate the farmers. But long story short, I decided I would do it and try to approach it from an economic standpoint. So I gave a speech to Dick Cheney on behalf of the community as to why we wanted them to annex this land. Well, the farmers gave their speech, we gave ours. Long story short is it took a year, but the military finally decided we're not going to buy the land and we're not going to move the division, so it was all for naught. During this period of time, being on the protocol list, I also had the unpleasant task of being invited during Desert Storm to the airport hangars out on the post every time they bought soldiers who were killed during the Iraq War. So I can't begin to tell you how many times, very painful to this day to talk about, but how many times I sat in those hangars and watched them bring these big cargo planes in and unload these soldiers with their young wives and children sitting there. It was very sad. Saw that probably 20 times during the time I was there. It was just a very unpleasant time, but again, this was something I was exposed to simply because I was in the banking business and was thrown in to the mix of people who were considered important to the Army. the Army, many people don't know this, and I didn't have a clue until I went out there, that the Army interacts with the communities that they're in extremely well. I mean, they realize the importance of the community, and the community realizes the importance to the Army, or to them. At any rate, a side note to this, after the Iraq War was over, General Sullivan, or no, it wasn't General Sullivan's, it was his predecessor, or his, the guy that followed him. He called one day and said, I'm going to invite about 10 people out because we've captured a lot of Iraqi equipment and brought it back to the States while we were over there. And would you like to come out and see it? So went out, and they had this acre lot, chain link fenced, and we got to tour the Iraqi equipment that was brought back from the war. I don't know, there must have been 30 or 40 pieces. It was junk. It was Russian surplus junk that the Iraqis were fighting with. It was so pitiful. I'm surprised they lasted as long as they did, because it was just nothing but 30, 40, 50-year-old junk that the Russians gave them to fight with. Anyway, it was kind of an interesting time as the general took us around and showed us each of the pieces and what it meant, how they used it, et cetera, how they captured it, the whole bit. General Sullivan left, I'm going to say in probably 85. I went out there in 82, he left in 85. I think I went through 4 change of commands on Fort Riley while I was there. So they moved him around quite a bit. General Sullivan went back to Washington, D.C. Shortly after, about 3 or 4 years after he went back to D.C., he obtained his 5th star. There's not a handful of 5-star generals in the world. And one day I received a letter, I still remain good friends with him, and I received a letter inviting me back to his change of command. He was being appointed as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the entire military. That is as high as you get. There's representatives on the Chiefs of Staff of all the services, and he was the chairman, which meant he sat on the president's cabinet. He invited me and about 5 other people to come back to Washington to his change of command, which I did. It was the most amazing thing. It was held on the grounds of the Pentagon, on the lawn outside the Pentagon. Sitting next to me was Wolf Blitzer, the famous columnist. Sitting in front of me was Colin Powell. The place was nothing but, I felt, what are you doing here? I felt like I was out of place because I'm in the presence of all these people, and what I know about the military you could fill a thimble with. But nonetheless, it was because of the military connection. That evening, he invited me and the other 5 people from Junction City to his home for a private dinner. And his home was on Fort Myers, which is just next to Washington National Airport. In his home was about a 10,000 square foot mansion on the post. And it was just the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. It was about 200 years old. Anyway, that was such a thrill to have known a person who had become that important in the military and in the government. And for somebody who hates politics as much as I do, it was still a thrill. So at any rate, that's my story about the military connection. However, also while in Kansas, you've all heard of the great Senator Bob Dole. Bob Dole was the senator from Kansas for a number of years, and probably during my 11 years in Kansas, I was in his office with a group of people from Junction City probably a dozen times. We were frequently making trips back to Washington because, again, trying to maintain that connection for the military purposes. I got to know Bob Dole quite well and found him to be an extremely wonderful person. Now don't throw anything at me for saying this, but I think the only reason he didn't become president is because he had somewhat of a Donald Trump personality in that he just said what was on his mind. He wasn't much to pull punches. Bob Dole probably didn't get elected president because of that, because he was too outspoken, but great individual, got to know him quite well. On my last meeting there, and this would have been a meeting that I had probably within 6 months of when I came to Hicksville in '92. We're sitting in his office, there's a handful of us sitting around, and Bob Dole says, guys, I may have to cut our meeting a little bit short because they're getting ready to take a vote on Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Do you remember that? The whole, what was her name? Anita Hill. Thank you. All that big thing was going on. He said, by the way, there's a little room off of the chambers. Would you like to go sit there and listen to this? We went to that room and got to listen to some of the hearing for Clarence Thomas. A huge piece of history. Didn't get to see Anita Hill, but we did get to hear Clarence Thomas answer a handful of questions while we were sitting there. But it was almost, you got to pinch yourself to think you're even a part of this, because this is history. At any rate, you know, he got elected, or he got appointed to the Supreme Court, and that basically was one of my last thrills before I came to Junction City or Hicksville. I spent 3 years in Hicksville, and actually I don't think there was anything that I have to tell you that was all that exciting. However, one thing happened, again, just by pure coincidence. I left here in August of '95. In July of '95, Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City building. Remember that? I'm sitting at home. I just built my house on Hiddenbrook. Sitting at home one evening, I've got the news on, and all of a sudden I see this familiar face on there, on the ABC News. And I said, my gosh, that's Eldon Elliott. He was a customer of mine in Junction City. He'd had a body repair shop, and he rented Ryder trucks. He rented the truck to Timothy McVeigh, and he called the FBI and told them, I think I know who did the bombing. And he was on national radio. I talked to him once after that. I called him and I said, Ellen, I said, I see you've made the news. He said, yeah, isn't that something? He said, I don't know what it was, but he said when that news came out about that bombing, and I saw that truck, he said, I know that I rented that truck to somebody. He went back and looked at these records. Timothy McVeigh was a soldier at Fort Riley during that time, a disgruntled soldier. He rented the truck from my old customer, loaded it with explosives, drove to Oklahoma City and did the bombing. Kind of a little side story. At any rate, spent 11, 12 years in Columbus, and I've got to tell you this story, and this is kind of a human nature story. It's a story about people and how gullible people are. This was right, I'm going to say about a couple months before I came back to Hicksville in 2007. A friend of mine said, you know, my wife's 50th birthday is coming up, and he said, I'd like to do something special for her. He said, I want to rent a limousine and take a group of people out for dinner. will you go? And I said, sure, love to. So we all gather at a central location, and we all pile in the limousine, and he said, you know what? He said, I just remembered. He said, today is autograph day down at the Shoe, Ohio Stadium. This is an event they hold every year at Ohio Stadium where they open the doors of the stadium and people can come and go and get autographs of players, coaches. It's just a big event. There are probably a couple thousand people show up, mostly kids. He said, let's buzz by there and see what's going on, because we did have a friend who had a son who played for Ohio State that year. So we drove down to the Shoe on Woody Hayes Drive, pulled right in, right up next to the stadium, right up the front gates of the stadium. I'm sitting in the back seat. I get ready to open my door, and the guy sitting across, one of my friends across from me, rolled down his window, and there's tons of kids and parents milling around. And he hollered out, and he said, he's here! Just as I'm stepping out, 40 people mashed me against the van. I've got a blue blazer, gray slacks, and an open collar white shirt, dressed for dinner. These kids are pressing against me with their parents behind. They think I'm somebody famous. And they want my autograph. True story. Never forget it as long as I live. So all these kids were rushing up to me with footballs and jerseys and paper and everything with pens in hand. I start signing autographs. I'm not exaggerating. I did that for 30 minutes. And those people have no clue who I am. Not a clue. One lady handed me her baby to take a picture. And they still don't know who I am. So finally, a couple of cops come over, and I think, oh boy, I'm in trouble. And they got up to me and said, sir, we'll help you with this crowd. They start pushing people away. And they said, give him some space. He'll get to you. Just give him some space here. They don't know who I am either. So finally, one of the other guys that's in the limousine, he gets out and he said, folks, he's late for an engagement. He's going to have to leave. And this lady looks at him. She said, he can't leave. My kid has been waiting for 30 minutes for his autograph. He's not going to leave until he gets his autograph. These people were nuts. I have never experienced anything in my life. It told me a great deal about people. To this very day, they don't know who they got an autograph from. I scribbled something on there that was unintelligible. And to this very day, some of these kids have got a football on their shelf in their bedroom with my name on it. And they don't even know who I am. Isn't that amazing how people are? After all these years, I wonder sometimes how many autographs do they have of mine? Under plate glass, maybe. And they didn't even know who I was. Anyway, that's just a human interest story about people. It was an experience that I really enjoyed. I have to tell you that the banking business gave me opportunities to do a lot of things that I wouldn't have had an opportunity to do otherwise, in terms of the military in Washington, D.C. and so forth. I don't want to leave Hicksville out, because probably my greatest experience was coming back to Hicksville in '07 and getting to spend the rest of my career here and working with some of the best people I ever met in business. I was blessed with a great staff and some very special people. It really was. And Cheryl, Mary Kay, Lynn, and Chad, they were great people to work with, and they're good human beings. And I'm just very blessed to have had the opportunity to be around so many people in the community, and then people who work for me and with me. It's just been a great experience. But like I said, I'm not here to talk about banking. I wanted to share some of my great stories, and that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, ever catch the West Virginia?
Did you ever
robbers?
catch the West Virginia robbers?
Yes,
They did.
after they'd robbed 7 more banks.
Wow.
Yeah. This was an amazing guy. I mean, he came in, he was dressed. I mean, I like to dress up. This guy had me beat. I mean, vested suit, tie, red hair, all combed nice, with a shotgun, and his girlfriend had on high heels and dress. I mean, they wanted to be modern day Bonnie and Clyde. And they pulled it off for a long time before they got caught.
That wasn't Bill Hofstadter in Columbus with you, was it? That sounded like something he'd do that.
You know what? Bill Hofstadter would have done something like that, but it wasn't Bill. No. Thank you.